Good afternoon, good morning, good evening from wherever in the world that you're dialing in. Very welcome to this panel. My name is SARA BAZOOBANDI. I'm an associate at ISPI and a Marie Curie Fellow at the German Institute for Global and Area Studies in Hamburg. This panel is the opening event of the year-long initiative, which will lead us to the 9th edition of Rome Med, the annual conference on the Mediterranean region that is co-organized by ISPI and the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs and International Cooperations. It is my great pleasure to have three distinguished speakers here today. I will go on and introduce them in order of their presentations. The aim of this panel is to unpack some of the questions about the Middle East North Africa region in year 2023. We have three speakers that are going to shed light on various issues from different perspectives. I would like to welcome Mr. JIHAD AZOUR, Director of Middle East and Central Asia Department at the International Monetary Fund. Mr. AZOUR is going to take the next few minutes talking us through the challenges, socioeconomic specifically challenges ahead of the region. The IMF has published its annual report for the year ahead in the region, and the predictions are quite alarming. There are warnings both on the global and regional level, of course, over the challenges ahead this year. There is, of course, the fund is providing specifically the Middle East, North Africa region with substantial financial measures to support the region with the challenges ahead and address economic uncertainties. So very welcome, Mr. AZOUR. It's a pleasure to have you. The floor is yours.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Thank you very much for having me. It's a great pleasure to start the year with you. Looking forward on the key issues that are going to shape 2023. Let me maybe start by highlighting what are the key driving forces. We're finishing 2022, which was, in terms of economic outcome, broadly speaking, better than expected, despite the various shocks that the region had to deal with, starting from the war in Ukraine to the increase in price of commodities, as well as also the impact of fighting inflation globally. And therefore, growth last year in 2022 was around 5.4%, which is, I would say, 2% higher than the average growth rate worldwide. But this level of growth, in fact, hides disparities that exist in the region between certain countries who were recovering faster, mainly the GCC oil exporting countries, and the rest. Therefore, 2022, the outcome was better than expected. However, 2022 brought with it a certain number of issues. Food security was one of the main issues that we had to deal with because of the impact of the war in Ukraine in supply of food and basic commodities. Second is inflation. Especially inflation was driven by food and fuel prices, what we call headline inflation, that constitute the big part of the basket of consumption for middle and low income people, and therefore there are here certain number of social implications. Three is the tightening of the monetary policy worldwide. This has led to increase in interest rates, but also drying up capital flows, and several countries in the region rely on those flows to finance their deficit. Last but not the least, the level of uncertainty that grew last year, and then it's expected to be with us in 2023. Therefore, 2022, relatively speaking, was better than expected. I would say the recovery post-COVID maintained its trend in 22. What is going to happen in 2023? Well, first of all, we have to expect that this year could be a turning point, because we see if various forces colluding or coming up together, we see a higher level of fragmentation that could affect a region that is at the center between East and West. And this is coming from increasing tension on the geopolitical front that could increase the risk premium and also have an impact on the overall economic performance this year. Second, still, fighting inflation would require tightening monetary policy, which means for people, higher interest rate, which means also slowing down the economy, which we expect for the region in 2023. In addition to that, we are still dealing with the aftermath of the COVID shock, especially at the level of unemployment that has reached high level, especially for the youth, and lower participation for women, which are important issues to deal with. Fighting inflation has led to a certain number of measures that were not, I would say, in terms of quality, the best, because the support was broad-based instead of being more focused, and the subsidies went maybe to everyone, which reduced their impact and their effectiveness and their ability to reach those who need them most. Another force shaping this year is also the recovery in China. And the recovery in China, if it is accelerated, it would have a positive impact on commodity prices and would improve the level of trade between the region and China. But I think what is important to focus on is the region is not uniform, and the diversity raises a certain number of specific challenges. Of course, GCC oil exporting countries benefiting from the measures taken during COVID and also increase in oil price are in a better shape. For those, we recommend that they keep the process of diversifying the economy, improving the level of labor participation, and reducing the risk of pro-cyclicality. We have another group that is the middle-income countries, those who are what we call the emerging economies in MENA. Those are faced with challenges. Inflation, high level of interest rates, slowdown globally are affecting them. And for those, proactive policies are needed. We can go over them in details during the session. There is a third group, and those countries, the low-income countries and countries in fragility, and there are some in the region, have a low level of growth or had a low level of growth in 2022. And they are, I would say, more sensitive to issues of food security, of climate change. And those countries are in dire need for support. And this is how we at the fund, I would say, structure our support to the region. For the low-income fragile states, we provide certain number of financial assistance, food security window, etc. And for the middle-income countries, through programs, we help them increase the level of attractiveness for investment, help them in the reforms. And for the high-income GCC countries, we help them in policy, and also we help them improve the level of support they provide to other countries. Back to basics, 2023, as I said, it's a transition year, but also it should help us transition to addressing the long-term trends. And here I see three long-term trends that we need to address: climate and climate change. This region is suffering from climate transformation. Over the last 2 decades, we issued recently a study that is showing that livelihood, inclusion, rurality is negatively affected by climate developments. And therefore, it's a must to address this through mitigation, but also it's an opportunity to help those countries transition and transition fast. We expect that this year, the COP28 in UAE will be an opportunity to provide more financing for transition. To technology. This is a young population that has competence, talent, and it's very important for those talents to, through technology, to be provided with additional job opportunities, especially the level of unemployment at the youth level is extremely high. 3 is how to deal with fragmentation. Clearly here we see tensions globally that are going to affect the way the economies of the world are going to work. And it's a moment for the region to rethink partnership and to have this partnership driven for prosperity of their population. And therefore, it's very important to improve the avenues that will allow capital to be channeled from one country to another, technology to be shared, and markets to be open. We see in here an opportunity for the region to grow faster. And this is why our annual meetings that are going to happen at the end of the year in the region, in Marrakesh, in Morocco, will be under the main objective of inclusion, of creating links between the region and its partner, Africa, Europe, and so on, and also promote the reforms that are needed in order to have a better structure of the economy that will allow economies to grow, and more importantly, to be more inclusive, to address social issues, to address social protection issues in particular, and to provide opportunities to all.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate your input. So the three major focuses, if I understood correctly, would be inclusion, strengthening the links with outside world and external partners, and reform. And the latter, perhaps, is the most challenging part in that region for various reasons, which we are going to shed light on them through this panel. At least we're going to try to address some of these challenges on the way to reform. And that sort of puts me in a good position to introduce our next speaker, Ms. LAMA FAKIH. LAMA is the head of Director of Middle East North Africa Division of Human Rights Watch, and very welcome to you, Lama. It's a pleasure to have you here. The human rights situation in the region is very gloomy in this particular period in time. Migration as a result of deterioration of socioeconomic and political conditions is rising, so is authoritarianism across the region. From Tehran to Beirut, we have uprisings, we have demonstrations, we have protests, demand for change, demand for reform, much needed reform, but there are various serious challenges on the way of this reform, and that sort of opens the door for various violation of human rights when the demand is made by the people and it's not met by the policymakers. And of course, the impact of the war in Ukraine on economic injustice in the region, on human rights issues, political freedom is quite visible. So the virtual floor is yours, Lama. I'm very much looking forward to your remarks on these questions.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you for having me. I actually would like to touch on a number of the trends that both you and Jihad referenced. I mean, as you said, the situation for human rights in the region is quite bleak. And I think that's the known reality for those living in the region and those that are close watchers of the region. Human rights are trending negatively. We have seen that there's shrinking space for civil society and free speech. We have a legacy of conflicts for which there has been rampant impunity for war crimes. Authoritarianism is entrenched. Many authoritarian leaders in the region actually have strong bilateral relationships with Western powers. And we see increasingly that these powers are deprioritizing human rights in furtherance of other national interests, like security and economic interests. Particularly, following the war in Ukraine, we saw European countries were prioritizing their energy needs and engagement with the Gulf states. And this has been to a clear detriment for human rights promotion in the region. We also see how other Western actors, non-state actors from global management consultancies, celebrities, athletes, influencers, how these are at the forefront of whitewashing human rights abuses of autocratic states. So as I was saying, governments in the region are attacking civil society and free speech, and dissidents are increasingly paying a high price for what is legitimate dissent. And as you mentioned, in MENA in 2022, a number of countries saw protests, including in Iran and in Tunisia. People took to the streets, they were demanding their rights, and often met with abusive law enforcement and detention responses. And in these and other countries like Egypt, we see that security forces continue to enjoy complete impunity for their crimes. In Saudi Arabia, we've seen how authorities are conducting arrests of peaceful dissidents, public intellectuals, human rights activists. They're sentencing people to decades-long prison terms for just posting on social media. Dozens of human rights defenders continue to languish in detention there. In Tunisia, which has been upheld as a beacon of the Arab Spring, we saw this past year how the president took steps to dismantle democratic foundations so he could consolidate power. Activists, journalists, others who've criticized these abusive steps have been detained, subjected to arbitrary house arrests, travel bans, and even criminal prosecutions. In Israel, security forces raided the offices of 7 prominent Palestinian civil society groups. They've issued closures, orders against them. And Palestinian civil society today faces nothing short of an existential threat. Civic space has also shrunk in Jordan, and we see how governments like the UAE are also using new tools, including surveillance technologies, to undermine free expression and stamp out dissent. Now, it wasn't just abusive detention practices in this past year, but we saw as well a chilling rise in executions. This was the case in Bahrain, where 26 people are now on death row, in Kuwait, where 7 people were executed this past November. And in March, we saw the Saudi government execute 81 men, and the largest mass execution in decades. Iran, as we all know, has also just recently started executing protesters, and they seem ready to be executing more. As these human rights conditions have deteriorated, many prominent activists have been forced into exile. But MENA countries have shown that they have an appetite to go beyond their borders to threaten and target dissidents abroad with surveillance, harassment, intimidation, abduction, and even assassination. And as Mr. AZOUR was commenting, at the same time, we see that economic conditions in many countries in the region have deteriorated. Larger numbers of people are no longer able to access quality food, water, electricity, healthcare, decent housing and education. And our governments, often entrenched in corruption and suffering from weak judicial institutions, are failing to implement the necessary reforms and implementing the necessary rights-respecting social protection schemes. In Lebanon, where I am, we've seen decades of corruption and mismanagement of the electricity sector lead to the simple unraveling of the sector, the state unable to provide even more than 3 hours of electricity a day. And this has impacted residents' lives, from the ability to store and cook food, to access education, work opportunities, to power medical and assistive devices, and just to enjoy a decent standard of living. In September, we also saw that there was a deadly cholera outbreak in the region, spreading across northern Syria, with fears that it would spread beyond into the country and the region more broadly. According to the Global Report on Food Crises, in this past year, 9 countries in MENA suffer from high severity food insecurity. MENA is also the most water scarce region in the world, and this only exacerbates food shortages. The International Water Management Institute has warned that climate change will only increase water stress. Iraq is one of the most vulnerable countries in the world to global warming and climate change. And as a major oil producer, the country's own outputs are directly implicated in these conditions. Recent reporting suggests that the flaring of natural gas in the oil production process in Iraq is correlated with worsening environmental conditions. And this has a direct impact on the right to health for Iraqis living in oil-producing provinces. Governments at the UN Climate Conference in Egypt in this past year, they concluded a historic deal to pay poor nations for damage from climate change. But the agreement didn't include urgent action to phase out fossil fuels, to cut emissions, or to improve climate targets. Now, we know that one of the main ways to incentivize government to deliver more ambitious climate policies is through public pressure. But this is exactly the kind of pressure that authorities in Egypt did not allow at the climate conference. And as we look toward the upcoming conference in the UAE, we are concerned about civil society participation and freedom of expression there. As ever, we see that marginalized communities, including LGBT individuals, refugees, and migrants, and the stateless, are among the most susceptible to these negative trends. And women in MENA continue to experience systemic discrimination in both the private and the public spheres. Now, there were some improvements. We saw in the Gulf that there were some modest labor reforms that did improve conditions for some workers there. In the lead up to the World Cup in Qatar, we saw that there were some labor reforms, but the benefits were limited because they were introduced too late, they were poorly enforced, and they were too narrow in scope. And despite the sacrifice that workers made, in some cases workers paying the ultimate price of their lives, we saw that FIFA and the country government refused to take forward the responsibility of compensating the victims of that abuse. Civilians in MENA also continue to suffer the consequences of conflict-related abuses. In the past year, despite having ceasefires in both Syria and Yemen, we saw civilians in both countries continue to be subjected to unlawful attacks that maimed and killed. Gaza also witnessed another round of hostilities in August. And despite a breakthrough in 2022 in a Syria crimes against humanity prosecution in Germany against 2 former Syrian intelligence officials, these conflicts continue to be characterized by impunity for war crimes. Libya is no exception in this regard, where currently an accountability-free zone has emboldened militias to commit violations and abuses with impunity. These worsening dynamics bring into laser focus the importance, on the one hand, of continued human rights advocacy, as well as the urgent needs to adapt our human rights toolkit and broaden our circle of activists and allies. In every country in the region today, we see that there are human rights crises unfolding. And for every abuse we document, we know there's an impacted person, a family, and a community that is affected. The challenges are systemic and the threats are existential. And this is why we see we really need to work hand in hand with our communities, with international institutions, to try to meet the challenges of the day and tomorrow. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You opened so many topics for discussion. Thank you, Lama, for your presentation. And I think there will be also a lot of questions during the discussion. And the overall message that I'm getting from your presentation is that the need for change is probably more than ever before, considering all the challenges that the region is facing. So there is a lot of urgency in this, specifically in this year ahead, to address some of these issues. Allow me to go to our next speaker. Very warm welcome to Mr. Harry VERHOEVEN. Harry is a senior scholar at Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia University. Very welcome to you, and it's a pleasure to have you here. And I believe that the next aspect of the challenges that we are going to cover in this panel is the question of energy, energy and of course climate change. The uncertainties in the global energy market has been increasing since the beginning of the war in Ukraine. Mr. AZOUR mentioned about the disparity between growth between different countries across the region, oil exporters and oil importers. So it would be very beneficial if you could talk us through the direct impact of these uncertainties on each of these groups, and also maybe shed light on what is the prospect of energy transition in the MENA region, realistically speaking. Again, Mr. AZOUR mentioned about the COP27 in Sharm el-Sheikh was held in the region. The next one, COP28, will be held in Dubai in the region. But what do we expect in terms of climate mitigation and adaptation efforts of these countries, specifically in the light of urgent sense that exists for food security, for water security? The region is quite fragile to these questions. So we are very much looking forward to hearing your remark. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Sarah. Thank you so much to the organizers for involving me in this discussion. A great pleasure to be on the panel with JIHAD and with LAMA. I've indeed been asked to say a few things about the politics, the political economy of energy transitions and climate in this very heterogeneous region. And I think what is striking indeed is this contrast between, on the one hand, a number of very important similarities between different parts of the region, namely the fact that there's hardly a state in the region that is not very acutely vulnerable to both the uncertainties and already, of course, the lived realities of climatic changes. And at the same time, of course, a radically different ability to make sense of these, to cope with these, indeed to partake in a meaningful way in discussions like the ones that we had in Sharm el-Sheikh and the one that is coming up in Dubai. At a very macro level, it's important to remind ourselves that the MENA region is experiencing average temperature increases in the last 30 to 40 years, twice the global average. Again, global warming affects everybody around the world, but in this region in particular. So, and because, in part of what Lama already mentioned, very deep pre-existing insecurities, especially in terms of access to water, and therefore the way that determines questions such as agricultural productivity or even the basic human rights of people, where they can live. This is a question that is going to stay with us and hopefully will be part of these kind of reflections for many years to come. Now, the fact that for the second year in a row, the region is playing host to the world's biggest annual gathering to talk about questions of mitigation and adaptation is important. It is important, of course, because it provides potentially at least a rallying point a means of pressure for civil society organizations, international organizations, a means for academics and scholars to make suggestions, and a means for governments and business sector actors to come together and pursue a number of reforms. And indeed, actually, in light also of the windfall that Jihad was referencing, the fact that a number of oil exporting countries have perhaps greater means available than at any prior moment in the last 15 years or so, should provide some space, at least, for some action, both politically, because it will be seen to be good to be undertaking action, and because it is expected by the world, but also financially. If, for example, a number of these oil exporting countries were willing to make greater contributions, not just to technological change at home, but questions of adaptation elsewhere in MENA, or indeed beyond even, I think that would be astute politics, as well as, frankly speaking, from a climate justice perspective, the right thing to do. Now, whether that is actually going to happen is a very different thing. As we've long known in the media region, there's a big difference between what should happen, what is in many ways the rational thing to do, or the ethically right thing to do, and what actually happens. And here is where I would really want to sound a note of caution. Again, as any student of the region knows, the politics of announcement in this region are pretty profound and often pretty disappointing. We could outline a very long list of promises, including, for example, by GCC countries, to transition much more rapidly to renewable energies, to invest very significant amount, both in neighboring countries, as well as I said, further afield, in helping with both mitigation as well as adaptation. Yet the track record of the last 20 years, the last 50 years, if you like, is profoundly disappointing on this score. For example, when it comes to the UAE, there's a lot of buzz in the media around prospective investments in renewable energy at home and abroad, but the simple baseline reality remains that the country derives more of its energy from coal than it does from renewable sources. And that coal is not some kind of legacy investment from 40, 50 years ago. It is something from the last 5 to 10 years. So again, it's important that we look at these politics of announcement with the requisite degree, let's say, of skepticism and of critical interrogation, because it's very important. Similarly, let me echo here the very important point that LAMA was making. 2022 was a bad year for activism, and especially environmental activism in the region. There were all the difficulties, as LAMA rightly said, in getting civil society from Egypt and from outside to partake in COP in the way it should have. There's also the much broader prospect of a widening crackdown on all kinds of people and all kinds of groups, some of whom are formal human rights activists, some of whom are just ordinary citizens who are raising grievances in places like Saudi Arabia or Egypt or the UAE, for that matter, around issues that could be categorized as environmental. This is profoundly worrying, again, not just because of its ethical implications, but because these kind of voices are absolutely essential if mitigation and adaptation are to be inclusive, broadly shared processes that actually contribute to long-term resilience and actually help us address many of the economic and political disparities that the previous speakers have very rightly highlighted. And that brings me to the final point I would like to make around climate change and energy transitions in this region, which is that the hope is, at least, that moments like the COP that is upcoming are also moments to rethink the predominant way of responding to climatic challenges. So far, again, once again, especially in oil exporting countries, the response to climatic changes has been very much top-down and very much technocentric. Essentially, the hope that a combination of sheer government power on the one hand, and on the other hand, some kind of degree of radical technological innovation can get us out of this predicament, both on the mitigation side, that is to say, the actual emissions of greenhouse gases, and in terms of living with a changing climate. What I think essentially many people in the scholarly community, and indeed in the activist community, are trying to say is that we need to radically shift that. Rather than seeing this as a top-down, as I said, technocentric process, we need to see this as a far more bottom-up, pluralistic process. That rather than trying to reinvent entire new systems, is trying to fix them, trying to actually build on what actually does work and what is functional, and what are great resources in the region, including, of course, its human capital, but also, for example, its indigenous, its native vegetation. And there's an incredible amount of local adaptation strategies that could be much more successful, arguably, than things that are yet to be invented or that are important from elsewhere, but that do require governments to let go of an element of control and of decision-making. And this kind of more decentralized approach, I think, to, as I said, adapting to climatic changes, offers, at least as far as I'm concerned, far greater chances of being successful, of being durable, and as I said, of not just responding to perceived environmental problems, but also to a whole range of social, economic and political inequalities that are so important in driving conflict and driving grievances, as the previous speakers have highlighted. But let me leave it at that, and very much, of course, looking forward to any questions or comments from the audience. Thanks, Sarah.
Thank you very much. So, of course, the floor is open to the audience. If they would like to raise any questions, they could type it in the Q&A box of Zoom, and I will go through them as they come through. But I would like to take advantage of my position a little bit and here kick off with raising some questions to get the debate going. And I would like to start with you, Harry. You touch upon very important issues. The question of politics of announcement. I think it's something that we see it in economic policies, as JIHAD mentioned. We've seen it in human rights issues, as LAMA mentioned, and when it comes to energy questions. Now, I want to take the question to sort of a different direction. Let's go to the east. The energy links between the region and east have been quite important. They're quite significant. They have increased as a result of rise of energy demand, especially in China and other Asian economic powerhouses. They bilateral investments, technological trade. In the peak of the pandemic, for example, China was one of the major vaccine suppliers to the GCC, and so on and so forth. So the relationship has expanded and evolved in various shapes and forms. To what extent do you think these relations are likely to shape the future of policymaking towards energy transition specifically? Because we're talking about a relationship that is built on a very beneficial trade of exchanging energy, hydrocarbon resources in exchange with financial reserves. So, and as long as that demand exists, it's quite comfortable to not want to touch that situation, right? Despite all the interesting points that might be raised in the COP meetings or beyond. Do you think that consolidation of relations have played or will play a significant role in that respect, or the region has sufficient reasons and sufficient rigidity towards change, if you will, to want to shape policies otherwise?
Well, thank you, Sarah. It's a very broad and very good question. I think two things come to mind. One is, of course, the fact that these relations today, of course, in the current era, concentrate very much on hydrocarbon links and the technological components that go with that relationship. But they're, of course, embedded in much older patterns of trade. And those older patterns of trade are very important because, of course, they do form a rather stark contrast with the kind of engagement that especially GCC states have had with the West for much of the 20th century and the 21st century. And so if you like, the social and cultural context in which a lot of this is embedded, without a lot of the prescriptive language that very often comes with dealing the West, undoubtedly makes for a much more pleasant, if you like, normative context to these exchanges. And that, I think, is a very important element of resilience, if you like, in GCC and Gulf or even Middle East and Asia, especially South and East Asia relations. But there's two further components which are indeed specific to the energy and climate question. The first is, of course, that the pace of decarbonization anticipated in Asia is, of course, radically different than that in North America and indeed in Europe, both because of commitments to mitigating climate change and, of course, because of changed geopolitical circumstances. And the war in Ukraine has highlighted this. Whereas, if you like, from a best case scenario perspective in Europe and the United States, this is providing further reason to accelerate decarbonization efforts and indeed to shift energy systems. We see that many Asian states, India notably, of course, but also China, of course, or Myanmar, for example, are taking advantage of the ability to import much cheaper Russian oil, thereby lowering their energy bills, but at the same time, of course, further locking in carbon-intensive patterns of development. And that leads to the second point. It's not just the pace of decarbonization that's radically different, but also, of course, the importance, once again, of internal disparities. You do see that there's pretty significant efforts in India and in China, as well as in more advanced Asian countries, that are being undertaken to decarbonize and to embrace, for example, all kinds of renewables. But at the same time, they're contending with huge parts of the interior in India, in China, and again in other Asian states, where that progress is much slower, and that are lagging behind, especially the coastal areas and the southern areas of those countries. And what we see is that political elites are using cheap energy, often relatively dirty forms of energy, as a way of buffering, of mitigating some of these inequalities, actually in a way that is not too dissimilar to some of the dynamics we've historically seen in MENA. And this, of course, again, poses the additional challenge that even if we can further intensify the actions being undertaken by certain Asian governments to decarbonize and to embrace wind and solar and geothermal and other forms of reducing their carbon footprint, that this inequality mitigating aspect of growth, and especially of hydrocarbon dependent growth, will probably continue to be there. And that will, of course, in turn, offer further reason to solidify those relationships that you were referring to. Again, an awful lot more to say about this, but I appreciate there's the limitation of time.
Thank you very much. Lama, I'll come to you with a sort of another relatively broad question. I want to get a little bit more in depth with two of the points that you raised. One is the question of transnational oppression, surveillance, attacking dissidents abroad, and so on and so forth. To what extent, I mean, we for example, we've seen a recent report by Citizens Lab about the transfer of technology from Western companies to Iranian security forces to filter internet access inside Iran and be able to expand its surveillance capacities and to control freedom of information and so on. To what extent do you think these questions, these transnational oppressions that are often facilitated with the use of technology and surveillance can be controlled at this stage? Can anybody control them? Can we regulate these activities or not? What can the global community do? What can the Western technological companies that sometimes perhaps inadvertently ended up in these transfer of technology help improving the situation? And secondly, you talked about civil society. Correctly, you mentioned that civil society space is becoming it has been shrinking over the past years, and that has been a trend, with regards to environmental activists, the women rights activists, children rights activists. We have seen it in different countries, in different spaces, by securitization of activities of civil society. The governments have clamped down on these activities. So how can civil society re-expand itself in the region, in this environment? Is it even possible? Can any change, any reform be expected in that respect or not? Sorry, I'm taking advantage of this knowledgeable speaker here, wrapping up 2 or 3 questions in one. But yes, all ears.
Thank you, Sarah. The question that you ask about transnational repression and in particular about surveillance is a really important one. And I think not only can we regulate this technology, but we must. We have seen how surveillance technologies have been used to go after critics, opposition, journalists, human rights activists. I myself was subjected to a state-sponsored surveillance attack using the Pegasus software in 2021. It was at a time when I was doing an investigation into the responsibility for the Beirut port explosion in Lebanon. And I know from my personal experience and also from the experience of, the cases that we've documented, just how nefarious this technology is when it is in the wrong hands and used against the wrong individuals. Surveillance technology companies and their government sponsors will say, this technology is used to go after criminals, to go after terrorists. But the reality we know is very different. And when it is used to target the wrong individuals, it not just has an impact on their rights to privacy, but also on their personal security. And no one is really free from these types of attacks. You know, we've seen heads of states that have been subjected to these types of attacks. And it raises questions about their susceptibility to being bribed and being influenced when all of their data is scooped up, when their telephones are used as monitoring devices, you know, able to, you know, be used as a microphone and as a video camera without regulation. So we have been advocating for a moratorium on the sale and export of surveillance technologies until there is an adequate regulatory scheme in place. And again, I think it's absolutely necessary. You know, with regard to your question about civil society, you know, it's not that civil society is shrinking. You know, individuals continue to speak out, to do so in very creative ways and very effective ways, but they are, you know, paying a very high cost for doing so. You know, so you know, for example, here in Lebanon, the Minister of Interior has banned LGBT gatherings or promotion of LGBT rights. And that doesn't mean that LGBT activism ends, but it means that the cost of doing that activism, that important work, increases. And, you know, these individuals are members of civil society, are often on the front lines of advocating not just for their own rights, but for all of our rights. And this is why it is really incumbent on us to ensure that it is known, you know, what is happening to them, and try to do advocacy, not just with local governments, but internationally, to create more space for civil society engagement. And I mentioned, and Harry mentioned as well, I mean, the importance of civil society engagement and things like, you know, the COP Climate Summit. And very much agreeing with Harry's sentiment that, you know, this cannot be a government-controlled enterprise. You know, moving towards more sustainable practices really does need to come from a groundswell. And unless you have space for civil society to engage, we're not going to get there. You know, we are not going to be able to meet these global challenges.
Thank you very much. And Jihad, thank you very much for patiently waiting to come back to you. I went sort of in the reverse order, started the questions with Harry. So you mentioned a lot of, I mean, I have a lot of questions, very hard to just list them down to one specific question. But you also touched upon, like all the other speakers, about the question of reform, the need for reform, the challenges on the reform. But you also mentioned about the proactive policies that certain states are adopting, if I understood correctly. Correct me if I'm wrong. I very much, I think probably the audience as well would be very interested to hear what sort of proactive policies are we talking about? What are the specific policy applications that we are likely to see this year? Are there any changes, or is there going to be business as usual, continuation of inflation, effort to control it but not very successfully, decline and depreciation of currencies in certain states, and people falling right, left and center into poverty, and the situation continues? Or in certain places we are likely to see solid changes, solid applications of certain policies, and if yes, what could they be? Thank you.
Thank you very much. You're asking, Sarah, a very broad question. This is why I said in the beginning, this could be a transition year. Inaction will probably lead to what we saw in the past, is coming too little too late in terms of reforming economies will lead to outbreaks equivalent to what we saw in the past. Therefore, I think this year is important, and we're trying to shed light on why it's important for policies to be activated very quickly. First, I think the first and important issue is an issue of inclusion. Clearly, over the last 3 years, with COVID and what came after COVID, we had a strain on two main categories in the population. Those who are in the informal sector, who usually, when there are crises constitute, I would say, the first source of buffer, which was not the case. We did a study recently that showed that the informality, in fact, did not protect as it used to do in the past. And also the issue of inclusion for youth and women. Clearly here, those are two main objectives to pursue for the next 5 to 10 years, and it's time to act about those. Increasing women participation in the region will create cumulatively in a decade more than $1 trillion of additional output. Dealing with unemployment at the youth level, it's a must, because now it has reached levels that are alarming, exceeding 30-40% in certain populations. Therefore, you have to act on that. Inclusion is very important, and inclusion has different ways, including also inclusion in terms of participation in decision-making. And here I would like also to converge with what has been said. You cannot, when you are a policymaker, address those issues alone. You need to have the other stakeholders with you, and therefore you need to find a way to include more civil society in the way decisions are being made or in the way issues are being solved, because you're not the only actor, and the other actors are as important as involved as you are. Therefore, I think we need to invent, and should be country by country, platforms whereby participation in decision-making is addressed. 3, in terms of inclusion, is the vulnerables. Look, we have issues that can be addressed by economic growth, but we have issues that need specific measures. Social protection need to be further targeted in order to address the needs of the low-income people, those who cannot afford an increase in prices. Refugees, internally displaced people. Those are groups that it's not, the trickling down of economic growth will not help them. Therefore, we need to be cognizant of that. Therefore, we need a new social contract. Can this be done on a country-by-country basis? I think part of it, yes, part of it, no. And it requires also to strengthen the resilience and the stability. We were talking about climate. The region, yes, of course, is not among the largest contributor in terms of emission, but it is one of the most affected. Clearly, all the studies are showing that it's not only affecting the ecosystem, but also the livelihood of people. Therefore, climate could be one of the drivers for investment, growth, and even regional cooperation, because water cannot be addressed on country-by-country basis. Therefore, we need to reformulate. We need to change the paradigm in the way we do regional coordination. Therefore, acting collectively is going to be important. And acting collectively should require also to introduce new actors and giving them a leading role. Private sector. I think it's very important to reconcile the region with the role of the private sector. Private sector should be more productive, invest more in talent, in people, and should create more jobs. But also, we need to rehabilitate the way all these forces in the society can contribute. Therefore, 2023 is a transition year. It's a very important one. It's a year with high risk, but also this is a year where the change that we see globally could open a way to address certain number of issues. As I said earlier, fragmentation is a big threat, but also fragmentation is a way to think, maybe to strengthen the relationship with the neighbors. Last week, we were discussing the issue of, for example, integration in the Maghreb countries. Only by removing barriers, you can create sustainable growth of 1% additional growth and could address 20% of the unemployment issue at the youth level. Therefore, I think where we stand today is we're in a situation where many of what needs to be done has already been analytically presented and articulated. What we need to do is move from thinking to action, and moving fast, because delaying reforms is very challenging for a region that has accumulated structural problems. Of course, if someone is listening to us today, he will feel a bit more down. But I would say, I believe that with all the changes that the world is going through, with also some of the bright spots, the fact that the region has more capital to invest in it, that climate, yes, is more visible on the agendas. We see several countries coming up with their climate strategies, targeting net zero by 2040, 2050. This is a good step. What we need to do is we need collective action. Internally, state and civil society; externally, international institutions, and also the international community of investors coming together. Not all the problems will be solved in the same time. The three objectives for this year is preserve stability, because this is the gateway to prosperity, work on structural transformation, and address the inclusion issues. Inclusion and addressing some of the issues that allow societies to at least to stabilize and to be more fair. Those are things that can be achieved in 2023.
Thank you very much. We have less than 8 minutes, I think, to wrap this up. But I just want to, if I may, you can take this question or not. I'll leave it to the panelists to decide. If you were to name the top 2 challenges on the way of the points that you raised, for example, LAMA point about deterioration of human rights condition, Harry's points about the question of environmental action that needs to be taken, or Jihad's point about the narrowing the gap between policy on paper and policy in practice. What are the top barriers? 1 or 2 would suffice if you were to name them. Whoever wants to pick the first as a first person to answer is more than welcome. I'm just going to leave it entirely up to you.
I'll quickly say something before perhaps passing it on to the colleagues. As I tried to say, I think one of the biggest obstacles to many of the challenges we've talked about, not only to the questions of climate and energy, is the silver bullet idea. This idea that kind of righteous and effective action can only come from one source, whether that source is a technology or it is a government. It is exactly trying to embrace the pluralism and the fact that uncertainty more than ever doesn't require doubling down on one source or one point of action or one actor, but rather understanding that it's different actors, whether it's at the regional level, at the local level, or at the national level, who have to act in coordination. That is absolutely crucial. Again, from everything we know about adaptation to past environmental transformations, and indeed to socioeconomic and political transformations, this almost always offers the best basis to actually manage this change, control it, and actually lead to empowering outcomes for the greatest possible number of people. But this is very difficult because there's another discourse, and it's also very strong in the Middle East and North Africa, which, especially around environmental threats, securitizes them, and thereby closes down discussion in the name of emergency and in the main name of rapid action. And this, as I said, I think is very ill-advised for actually addressing those problems, as well as I said, also, of course, at an ethical level, profoundly upsetting. So if I were to hope for one change, it would be this one.
Thank you very much. Who would like to go first, Jihad or Lama? You'd rather not take this one, it's up to you.
Sarah, I'm happy to. I mean, I just very briefly, I think, if one thing were to change, the thing that I would focus on is independence of the judiciary. And I touched on issues related to impunity and weak judicial institutions, but this is where we see the difference between, having rights promotion and respect for human rights and not. The absence of independent judiciaries in most of the countries in the region where we're operating. And this is due to issues of corruption, but also institutional issues in terms of, who gets to elect or select judges. And there are concrete things that can be done to improve this. And there is a role as well for the international community to play. So I think it's a very fundamental area where we need to see reforms, and very concretely where we will see that those reforms pay dividends in the short term.
Thank you very much. And last but not least.
No, very, very quickly, I think the real issue I see, and this is an issue that is growing, is trust. There is an issue of trust between stakeholders. And people are not trusting their decision makers. Decision makers are not trusting civil society. Those societies are not trusting international community. I think the issue of trust is an important one. And also related to the issue of trust is how to accept how to work together. Again, I don't think we need to more work on the diagnosis or on the solutions. We need to work more on the how and how fast. The how will create winners and losers. Losers need to be compensated. Winners need also to be also equitably participating. The how fast, I think we cannot delay. The region has been traditionally delaying or doing too little too late. I think we cannot delay. And last point is look, maybe because I deal with other countries who are as challenged as the countries in the region, I have maybe some glimpse of hope that in any challenge, you have ways to turn it around. Latin American countries in the 80s, 90s did the major transformation and their political, judicial, economic system. We saw also in South Asian countries some major transformation. Therefore, I don't believe that the region is not able to do those transformations. Again, going back to the point of trust, the trust is a process. It's not something that you can decide, but it's something that you can build. And building it requires collaboration.
Thank you very much. So, independence of judiciary, pluralism, and act in cooperation and rebuilding the trust. Thank you very much to all of you, and it was a pleasure to be with you. Good luck.
Thank you.